And welcome to this special segment of TI Now with G. Rittenhouse. He's the Senior Vice President of the Cloud and Virtualization Group at Cisco. And G, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Abe.
Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure.
G, we've talked before about network visibility, but now we've moved really further away from the core network into the edge. And we'll get into that in a little bit about what that means. But I want to talk today about network visibility all the way up the chain, all the way up the stack to edge visibility and what that means for IoT. Can you give me an example or an illustration of what that means?
So in the early days of IoT, we had simple devices that would do remote measurements, then bring them back to some central processing program or business or whatnot, do the evaluation and present that. And so that kind of end-to-end view was important to a certain extent, but wasn't actually critical to the application as long as you had basic connectivity. But as IoT and the digitization of business becomes more and more prevalent, we find that it's not just about data at rest in an application or in a data center, but there's also data in motion. And that the processing of that data is best pushed towards the edge so that you don't have either the latency or the bandwidth costs bringing all that data back to a central group and then applying it there or actually taking the measurements there.
Now, we talked earlier about the separation of the control plane and the data plane, and of course, we've heard this many, many times. You have a deep understanding of what that means, but a lot of people watching this may not have that understanding. But you gave a good illustration. The illustration was you can have one or two sensors tapping the network, and that requires some kind of bandwidth capability. But when you have billions of sensors tapping the network at the same time, that's a whole different story. Again, can you give me an illustration of what that means?
Sure. In the past, we used to think about either a small number of sensors or the classic sensors of video and whatnot. And so when you take a look at a mobile network, people normally think about it from a data plane perspective. How much bandwidth, what is the speed, what is the capacity of that network? But when you start talking about billions of sensors, even though the individual bandwidth or the number of bits per second is pretty low, the fact that they keep hitting the network, keeping the sessions open, keeping that signaling plane open of where they are, establishing the connection and whatnot, you quickly then exhaust the signaling plane, even though from a data perspective, it's quite small in aggregate. So separating that out, being able to have a separate control plane that can expand or contract based on the amount of sensors or what the sensors are doing from the data plane is actually very similar to the software-defined networking transformation we saw in the data center 5 or 10 years ago, that separation of the signaling and control traffic from the data traffic.
I want to go back for a moment to the value the value at the edge of the network pertaining to the Internet of Things. Can we start with a business case at that edge and sort of take me all the way back to the core network?
So at the edge, you saw the transformation and the value explosion there about a decade or so ago as we started putting services at the edge from layer 2 through 7. Now you start to see the same kind of transformation happening on the computation side, being able to do local data analytics, being able to do business analytics there, making the decisions locally, and then moving yourself through the network. And so obviously when you're doing a lot of, take for example, video processing, you do a lot of the video processing local, then establish a link, still pretty high bandwidth, all the way through the core. So the core will continue to be driven from a traffic perspective based on video and video-like media, and then going all the way back into the data center at its heart.
I want to stay on the topic of business for another moment. Clearly, Cisco has hundreds of customers and a number of partners as well. How do you know as a business whether or which technology to invest in, whether it's 2G, 3G, 4G, or even the impending 5G in the next 5 or 7 or whatever, how many years? Again, as a business, a medium-sized business, how do I know how to mitigate my risk as far as which technology to invest in?
So from a business perspective, as you look at the rollout, there are these trends, the wireless trend that you mentioned. And by the way, we do see a lot of business opportunities, even in the legacy networks around IoT, because the cost of the sensors has been driven down so much relative to the new technologies. So we do see a wide spectrum of technologies available for the business, including Wi-Fi and on-prem and whatnot in the enterprise. So what we see is beyond the technology, a lot of the business opportunities and a lot of the issues that our customers are bringing towards us is around the management and automation of these networks, that you can't just sit there and design a network for voice or data or video, but that is changing dynamically over time depending on the usage and the introduction of these new technologies. So that control plane automation and optimization of these network resources is really what's driving a lot of the business beyond just the underlying technologies.
So if my business's flagship device is outdated or needs to acclimate to the next technology, does the 4G technology acclimate to the device, or the device has to be swapped out to acclimate to the technology?
I would say that the device has to be swapped out because the 4G, 5G type technologies are being driven from a very different business directive, where you're dealing with lots and lots of applications, lots and lots of users, and the user growth, capacity growth, and the cost per bit reduction. And so it's not being driven to satisfy particular IoT technologies. In fact, it'll be the other way around, that the IoT technologies will have to leverage these new generation of mobiles.
Gee, as you know, there's a number of NFV lab efforts across the country, across the world. We're only a day away from the Open Platform NFV event. I know that Light Reading has an NFV lab. TIA is working on an NFV lab as well. How do you coordinate all of these Open Platform NFV labs?
Well, for us, the main principle around NFV is the agility and speed of creating new services in the marketplace. And we understand at Cisco that even though we have a large portfolio around NFV, it is a whole ecosystem that's required to accomplish this. And so being able to interoperate, being able to not only do it in theory, but actually demonstrate the interoperability and be able to bring credible multi-vendor designs to market is a critical piece for us. So we actually welcome all of these efforts and being able to bring Cisco NFV gear and NFV orchestration and whatnot into these things to help bring some unity into this marketplace.
And how far are we from that unity, would you say?
Well, NFV is much more than just a technology effort. There's a lot of business processes, organizational issues. It's really just thinking about the traditional services in an entirely new way. So I think what you'll end up seeing, and you've seen this in the press already, lots and lots of proof of concepts, lots and lots of trials around it. But I think what you'll start to see is traditional, very simple but traditional services being replaced in an NFV type method, and then expanding from there as the service providers and others get more comfortable with it.
So we've all heard the big numbers, 30 billion, 50 billion connected devices by 2020 or 2025. Can the equipment, and I'm not talking specifically about Cisco's equipment, but can the network equipment, both hardware and software, support that many devices pinging the network, let's say over the next 5 years?
In that case, it really depends on the density. So when you look at numbers, particularly those large numbers that you reference, these are global numbers. And so while 30 billion devices is a big number, we have 5 billion or 4 billion users on the network today. So it's a factor of 5 or 6. That's not a big issue. But if it's spread globally, if it's spread very locally and only in particular industries or only in particular markets like video, then the network does have to undergo a transformation. And we see this as we spoke about the edge doing more processing, the edge doing more of the termination to aggregate a lot of this information and process it locally and then stream it back. And everything around that type of architecture motion is to make it more uniform across the globe, or at least across a particular network technology.
I want to finish up the discussion about IoT, talking about IoT security. One of the questions that seems to come up more times than not about IoT security is whether companies like yours, and not specifically Cisco, whether you embed the security during the manufacturing phase and however you do that, each company does it differently, or is it more of an afterthought or more of an overlay after the fact? Where are we on that kind of spectrum of discussion?
Well, quite frankly, I think up until recently, over the last few years, a lot of the security has been as an afterthought or as an OTT or simply putting in a device someplace in the network. I think the trend is very much towards the level of embedding security everywhere. It's not enough just at a device. We've seen what happens at local pay inside of an on-premise payment authentication and whatnot. We have to embed it in the chips, we have to embed it in the network, we have to embed it in the data and in the processing. So it is absolutely end-to-end, and from the basic PHY layer devices all the way up the stack.
If you don't mind, is it possible to offer up a doomsday scenario if this embedded security wasn't really across the board in the next couple of years? Because we know that not everybody's doing this. Is that right?
Let me put it this way. As this technology becomes more and more critical to businesses, to healthcare, to traffic, to all of the verticals that we're accustomed to, there becomes a dependency on this type of technology. And if that technology is compromised, whether through a data breach, a security breach, or an infrastructure failure or whatnot, the consequences are just much more and much more critical for us. That's why there's so much effort being put in to security, reliability, infrastructure build-outs, the architecture of where these things are occurring. All of those are absolutely critical issues that we are solving as an industry because of its importance and gaining importance into our economy and into our personal lives.
I want to finish up again. One more question about next generation technologies, 5G networks. Would you assimilate 5G more with NFV rather than IoT with 5G? In other words, there's more of a conversation between NFV technologies and 5G networking than IoT. IoT's involved in there somewhere on the scale, is that right?
I would agree with that, but I think there's another trend that's happening in the 5G. Up until 2 through 4G, it was all about the air interface, the MAC layer, the spectrum available and whatnot. With 5G, we see a much more agile network, heterogeneous network, technologies, as you point out, around NFV and others that can quickly change the configuration of the access point and the spectrum that's available to it and whatnot. So we see 5G as being a culmination of different technologies, being able to be coordinated and optimized as one network technology, but really incorporating a heterogeneous type of technology spectrum that is able to, using NFV and NFV type technologies, adjust on the fly to all of the different environments that it faces.
So is there an immediate impact that you can see between 5G networking or 5G networks and IoT? Something, a use case or a business case?
Well, for example, with IoT, if you think about video, as a sensor, one of the big considerations for 5G networking is around content and being able to move away from, let's say, a standard IP connection model to a content-based model, and using content as the address and whatnot. And so that's a very, very large change and disruption based on video, based on the kind of video sensors and content driven from an IoT type application in a 5G network.
Of course, prior to coming to Cisco, you were very much in a leadership role at Bell Labs for a number of years, also in a leadership role now.
Yeah.
As far as IoT goes, what's the most exciting thing for you?
So I've been around IoT, for decades. So it's always been the hockey stick, the beginning of the hockey stick, and focusing on the early Macs, early software and whatnot. I think the biggest, most exciting thing for me is the movement away from a point application into a complete kind of modernization of the enterprise. And so it's not just a particular device or a particular application, but when you see the impact, that coupled with cloud, coupled with wireless devices and technology, since we're all the mobile workforce and whatnot, that's where for me personally, it's extremely exciting, because you see the acceleration, you see the willingness to pay, and you see the coupling, the acceleration of the traffic from the cloud to the device. So you really have both ends of the spectrum there that you've never really had before. You've only had the individual components, and now with the cloud and digitization, you see it all coming together so quickly.
So you don't feel that enterprises are moving to IoT too quickly and really chasing the money per se?
No, I don't. You see automatic returns on investment. You see a lot of these things being driven from the chief operations officer, the chief finance officer, as they're able to squeeze more and more efficiency out of their business, and from the marketing side, being able to satisfy their customers much more quickly and really understand the markets that they play in.
Gee, thanks for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for coming.